She woke up in a locked room with no memory, a hospital band on her wrist, and a dog staring straight into her soul. The nurse said she had no family, no past, no reason to leave, but the dog didn't believe it for a second. That night, it broke the window, pulled her outside, and dragged her into a world where strangers wept just from seeing her face. Everywhere they went, people whispered her name like it had once meant everything, until someone began following them in a silver car with blacked-out windows. She remembered nothing, but he remembered her, and he'd spent years making sure no one else ever would. One step closer to the truth, and another person from her past mysteriously disappeared without a trace. And just when she thought the dog was leading her to safety, it took her back to the very house where everything was stolen. There's a reason she was erased. And someone is still watching, waiting for her to remember what no one was ever supposed to survive. She doesn't know it yet, but the man who ruined her life calls her every week just to check if she's still doing okay. It all started with a leash in her hand and no memory of how it got there, just the frayed leather wrapped around her fingers like a lifeline to a world she no longer understood. The morning light poured through the dusty window of the small, unfamiliar room, and for the briefest moment, she thought it might be heaven, until she heard the low growl of a dog at her feet, and remembered that heaven never smelled this strongly of antiseptic and old wallpaper. Her name, Martha, was stitched onto a pale blue cardigan hanging over the back of a chipped wooden chair, but when she tried to say it aloud, her voice caught in her throat like it didn't belong to her anymore. A calendar on the wall read April, 2025, and though the numbers were fresh, her heart sank beneath the weight of something older, something lost. She reached out to touch the dog's head, and the German shepherd didn't flinch. Instead, it pressed its snout into her palm, warm and steady, like it had been waiting for this moment far longer than she had. The door creaked open, and a tall man in a soft gray sweater stepped in, his smile as gentle as the light behind him, though there was something in his eyes that didn't quite match the softness in his voice. "Good morning, Martha," he said slowly, like each word had been carefully chosen to sit just right between comfort and control. "How are we feeling today?" "A little clearer, perhaps." She wanted to ask "Who are you?" but the question stayed trapped behind a thick wall of confusion, and instead, she simply nodded, unsure if that was the answer he wanted or the one she believed. The man introduced himself as Dr. Emerson, Harvey, he insisted, with a little chuckle, and said he'd been watching over her since the episode, though he didn't elaborate on what exactly the episode had been. He spoke of rest, of the importance of staying indoors, of how the world could be overwhelming for someone whose memories were in pieces, and she listened with the polite distance of someone trying to fake her own presence. The dog never looked at him once. Its eyes remained locked on hers, as if waiting for her to remember something it couldn't say. That evening, as the wind began to slip through the cracks in the windows and the shadows lengthened across the faded floral wallpaper, Martha stood by the door with the leash still in her hand, though she had no memory of ever taking it off. She stared out at the gravel driveway, the iron gate, the empty road beyond, and something inside her shifted, something quiet and ancient, like a clock starting to tick again after decades of silence. She didn't know what it meant, but the dog did. It let out a sharp bark, then nudged her hand, then the door, and then her hand again, more insistent now. Harvey had said she wasn't ready to go outside. He'd warned her that wandering off could be dangerous, that her mind might not be able to handle unfamiliar places, but the truth was, nothing in that place felt familiar, not the photographs on the mantel, not the books on the shelf, and certainly not the man who called himself her doctor. She didn't remember much, but she knew this: when a dog looks at you like you're home, you follow. And so she did. The door wasn't even locked. It swung open like it had been waiting too, and the wind carried the scent of lilacs, dust, and a memory she couldn't quite catch. She stepped out barefoot, unsure whether she was fleeing from something or returning to something she once lost, and the gravel beneath her feet was cold but grounding, like it wanted her to feel every step. They moved fast, faster than she thought an old woman and an aging dog could possibly move, but somehow, her legs remembered something her mind didn't, and each step felt more certain than the last. They slipped through the side gate and into the night, the sky wide and humming overhead like an unfinished lullaby, and she wondered if maybe the stars remembered her even if she couldn't. They didn't go far that first night, just across the road and through the trees to a narrow path that led somewhere she couldn't name, and though the wind howled and the darkness grew thicker, the dog never hesitated. It walked like it knew the way. It walked like this journey had already begun long before she opened her eyes in that little room. And when they reached a clearing with a bench beneath an old oak tree, the dog stopped and sat. Martha sat too, heart thudding with the unfamiliar weight of freedom. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know who she was. But she wasn't alone. Not truly. Not anymore. She looked at the dog, at the stars, at the way the world suddenly seemed to stretch open in front of her like a map waiting to be followed, and for the first time in years, perhaps even decades, she whispered a question into the night. "What are you trying to show me?" "I think I can show you." The dog didn't answer her with words, because words were for people, and what Martha needed now was something much older than language. Instead, the German shepherd stood slowly, stretched its front legs across the wet leaves beneath the old oak tree, and turned its head just enough for her to follow, not in command, but in quiet invitation. She didn't know how it could possibly understand the question she had whispered into the night, but the truth was, deep down in her chest, she felt something stir the moment it began to walk. It wasn't the hurried pace of escape this time, not the panic of fleeing some invisible threat in the dark, but rather the sure-footed rhythm of something with a purpose. They moved through a narrow path just beyond the edge of the trees, and although her knees ached and her breath came in slow, uneven waves, Martha kept going, one step at a time, driven not by memory but by trust in the creature at her side. The first thing she saw through the mist was a porch light flickering in the distance, glowing like a lighthouse across the vast ocean of her mind, and with every step toward that small glow, something in her heart began to throb, not in pain, but in recognition, like a song she used to hum but forgot the lyrics to somewhere along the way. The bookstore sat on the corner of a quiet street, its windows clouded with years of dust and time, yet the bright red chair inside the front display stood out like it had been waiting just for her. She hesitated as they reached the door, because even though the place looked empty, her stomach tightened the way it might before opening a long-lost letter from someone who once meant the world. The dog didn't pause. It pressed its nose to the glass and looked back at her, and that was enough. She reached for the handle, and just as her fingers touched the cold brass, the door opened from the inside. The woman standing in the threshold couldn't have been younger than 70, but her voice cracked like she hadn't spoken in years. "Martha?" she asked, her hand trembling over her chest as if holding back the pieces of a shattered heart. "Is that really you, sweetheart?" Martha opened her mouth to speak, but again, the words betrayed her, slipping away like mist over a field at dawn, and all she could do was nod. The woman stepped back, eyes shining in disbelief, and gestured for her to come in. The store smelled of cedar, old paper, and something warm that Martha couldn't quite name, but as she crossed the threshold, she saw the photos pinned to the wall behind the register, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and right there in the middle was a picture of her, holding a stack of children's books, smiling in a way she didn't even recognize. "You used to read every Thursday afternoon," the woman said gently, guiding Martha to the red chair by the window. "The kids loved you, you know. You always brought that dog," said she kept the stories grounded in truth. Martha looked at Rube, who now sat quietly beside her feet, ears perked like she too was listening for something deeper. "I'm sorry," Martha whispered, her voice barely more than breath. I don't remember." The woman, whose name turned out to be Edna, reached out and touched Martha's hand without judgment, only kindness. "That's all right, honey. That's all right. Sometimes memory comes back when it's ready, not when we force it." As the fire crackled in the old stone hearth, Edna began to tell her stories, not just of the bookstore and the children who waited each week for Martha's gentle voice to bring dragons and grandmothers and heroes to life, but also of the quiet mornings when she'd arrive early, help organize the shelves, and speak with a man named Joseph who always sat in the back with a cane and a faraway look. At the mention of his name, something flickered behind Martha's eyes, a flash, maybe, or a ripple in the still water of her thoughts, and for a moment, she saw a man's hand reaching for hers, their fingers laced together over a checkered tablecloth. But just as quickly as it came, the image vanished, leaving behind only the sting of tears she didn't understand. "You asked me once," Edna continued, stirring a mug of tea for her, "what would happen if you ever forgot everything. You said you were afraid of losing your story." She leaned in, her eyes suddenly sharp with something almost sacred. "But you also said the dog would know. You told me she'd remember the way back." Martha looked down at Rube again, and in that moment, something inside her softened, like the first warm breeze after a long winter. "Why would I say something like that?" she asked, barely managing the question through her cracked voice. Edna hesitated, glanced over her shoulder, then lowered her voice like a secret was about to cross her lips. "Because you were starting to forget, and you didn't want him to know." Martha's breath caught him. The word echoed through her like a bell in an empty church, and she didn't know who Edna meant, not yet, but her hands began to tremble as if her body did. That night, Edna offered her the small guest room upstairs, and for the first time since her awakening, Martha lay down beneath a quilt that didn't feel sterile or cold, but worn and real, stitched with love and time. And before she drifted into sleep, Rube curled up at the foot of the bed, keeping watch. The house creaked softly, the way old houses do, not in warning but in remembrance. And as Martha stared at the ceiling with questions blooming like wildflowers through her chest, she finally found her voice again. "Edna," she whispered through the darkness, "what happened to Joseph?" "Joseph passed, but not the way they said." Edna's voice came quietly through the crack in the door just before sunrise, the kind of whisper that only comes from someone who's carried the weight of a secret for far too long. "Joseph passed, but not the way they said," she murmured, each word brushing gently against the stillness of the morning like wind through an open screen. "There were things about that day I've never told anyone, not even you, Martha, when you asked me the first time." The bedroom felt smaller somehow as Martha sat up slowly, her bones aching not from age but from the heaviness of truth inching closer than it had in years. The dog was already awake, ears alert, as if she too understood that this morning would be different, that something had shifted in the air while the world slept. Martha didn't remember Joseph, not really, just flickers of a tall man in a wool coat and the way his hand rested over hers, not possessively but protectively, like someone trying to shield a candle from the wind. Edna pushed the door open fully now and stepped inside with a mug of tea in both hands, setting one down on the side table like it was part of some sacred ritual they'd shared once before. "He didn't die from his heart, like they told everyone," she said, her voice steady but distant, as if she were reading from a book she'd only skimmed until now. "He died of despair, Martha, because he knew something wasn't right with what they were doing to you." Martha's breath caught, and though her mind still grasped at fog, her heart began to pulse with something deeper, an instinctive knowing that whatever had happened to Joseph, it had been tied to her. "They said he passed in his sleep," Edna continued, her eyes now glistening with something too heavy for tears alone. "But he was trying to reach you that night. He'd gotten hold of something he said would stop everything before it went too far." For a long while, the only sound in the room was the quiet clink of her spoon against the inside of the cup, the kind of small sound that filled the space where words weren't ready yet. "He had documents," Edna finally said, lowering her voice as if someone else might be listening. "Things that proved someone was trying to make decisions on your behalf that you never agreed to." Martha stared into the tea as if the answers might rise to the surface like leaves on the wind, but all she saw was her own reflection, tired, aged, and still searching. "They said he fell down the stairs," Edna went on, now trembling with the weight of a memory too long buried. "But Joseph didn't fall, honey, he was pushed. And I think, no, I know, it had something to do with that man you always called your doctor." That name returned like a bitter wind through an open crack in the walls, Harvey. She hadn't seen his face in her dreams, not yet, but she remembered his voice now. She remembered the way he spoke in circles, the way his words wrapped around her like a blanket too tight to breathe through. "You told me once," Edna added softly, now sitting beside her on the bed, "that if anything ever happened to you, if you started to forget or people started to lie, I was supposed to trust the dog." Martha glanced at Rube, who had now risen to her feet and walked to the door, tail still, posture stiff, as if signaling that it was time to move again. You said she'd take you back, one place at a time, to find what you'd lost and maybe even who took it. For a while, they sat in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because it already says everything that matters. Then, slowly, Martha stood, her knees clicking, her balance uncertain, but her resolve growing with each breath. She couldn't remember Joseph's voice, not yet, but she remembered, deep in her chest, what it felt like to be safe. I need to keep going, she said quietly, not as a plea but as a promise. There's something out there waiting for me to find it, something they didn't want me to remember. Edna helped her pack a small bag, mostly just water and an old sweater, and hugged her so tightly at the door that it made Martha's ribs ache with the sweetness of being wanted. If you get close to the truth, she whispered into her ear, he'll try to stop you again. Just promise me you'll be careful this time. Martha stepped out into the morning light, the sky still streaked with pink and blue like watercolor spilled across the heavens, and felt the cold air fill her lungs like the first breath of a second life. The dog trotted ahead, as steady as ever, leading her toward the narrow sidewalk that curved gently around the hill and down toward town. They walked for nearly an hour before Martha saw the next place, an old train station tucked between two overgrown lots, its red bricks crumbling, its sign faded, but its presence undeniable. Something about the tracks, the rusted bench, and the sound of distant wind moving across the rails made her pause. She turned to Rube and narrowed her eyes, her voice now steadier than it had been since the journey began. Why would I come back to a place like this? Because you stopped her from jumping. The answer didn't come in the form of a sentence, nor did it arrive wrapped in clarity like some well-delivered line in a play. It came in silence, in the aching hush that always seems to hang thickest around train stations at dawn. And in that silence, as Martha stood near the edge of the cracked platform with the wind curling around her ankles, the dog simply sat beside the bench, unmoving, eyes fixed on something long gone but not forgotten. Martha stared at the empty tracks and felt an odd pull in her chest, not quite pain but not far from it either, like a thread being gently tugged by a memory buried deeper than she dared to dig. And then, as if the cold had seeped through the soles of her shoes and crept upward into her heart, a picture began to form, not a clear one, but more like a watercolor painting blurred by rain, soft at the edges, but unmistakably real. There had been a woman there once. Not young, not old, somewhere in the middle of life and despair, wrapped in a green wool coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her face. Martha didn't remember her name, not yet, but she remembered the sound of her voice, a whisper at first, and then a sob, and then, most vividly, the long pause before she had stepped toward the edge of the platform, one foot already hovering over the rails. That image, once locked away, returned now in vivid, wrenching clarity, and with it came the memory of Martha's own hands, reaching, grabbing, pulling, right as the train's horn echoed through the canyon. She hadn't spoken, she hadn't needed to. She had simply held the woman with both arms and waited until the shaking stopped, until the tears turned to breath again. And then came the words, the ones that still echoed, even now, like church bells through fog, you said no one should ever leave this world thinking they're invisible. The bench creaked now as someone sat upon it, and when Martha turned, she saw her, not the shadow from the memory, but the woman herself, aged now, hair gray and thinning, but those eyes still sharp, still weary, still carrying the weight of a moment that never fully left. I knew you'd come back here someday, the woman said, not as a question but as a truth, weathered by time and held close to the chest like an old photograph folded too many times. You saved me that morning, and I never got to thank you, not properly, anyway. Martha sat beside her without hesitation, though her heart still beat too fast and her palms felt unsteady. I don't remember your name, she said honestly, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the strange sorrow of knowing someone remembers you when you can't return the favor. The woman smiled faintly and looked out across the tracks. Clara, she said. Just Clara. I used to come here every Friday morning, waiting for a son who never came home. I think I was punishing myself more than anything else, believing if I hurt long enough, maybe the universe would send him back to me. The wind kicked up, scattering old leaves across the platform, and Martha shivered slightly, not from the cold but from the sudden understanding of just how much grief could build inside a person without ever spilling over. "You sat beside me for hours," Clara continued, her voice low and almost reverent, "never asked me to explain, never told me I was crazy. You just sat there, and when I tried to step forward," she paused, voice cracking ever so slightly, "you held on like your life depended on it. Not mine, yours." Martha's eyes stung, and her voice came out rough, like it hadn't been used in years. "I didn't want to lose you." "No," Clara said, nodding slowly. "I think you didn't want to lose yourself." Those words hung in the air longer than anything else had that morning, and though Martha didn't fully grasp their meaning, she felt the tremor of recognition echo somewhere deep within the quiet chambers of her soul. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and in the dark behind her lids, she saw flashes, her own hands trembling over documents, a voice telling her she was confused, and the warm strength of Joseph's arm curled around her waist on a cold morning. But again, as always, the memory slipped before she could catch it, like mist through trembling fingers. Clara stood slowly now, her joints stiff but steady, and placed a folded piece of paper in Martha's hands. "You gave me back my life," she said, "and I wrote this down, just in case you ever needed something to remind you who you are." Martha unfolded the paper with careful hands, and though her eyes blurred with tears, she read the words written in a shaky hand, words she herself had once spoken but no longer recalled. "Even when the world forgets you, your kindness leaves fingerprints behind." She pressed the note to her chest as Clara walked away without another word, disappearing down the street with the quiet grace of someone who had finally closed a chapter that had been left open too long. The dog stood now, tail low but wagging gently, and looked to the left, toward a narrow trail leading down behind the old station, toward something Martha hadn't seen yet. She wiped her eyes and looked at the fading tracks one more time before asking aloud, her voice thick with wonder and weariness, "Where are we going next?" "Because this is where you found her." The path behind the station curved gently downward, winding between tall hedges and rustling trees that seemed to remember more about her past than she did, their branches whispering fragments of old stories with every brush of the wind. Martha walked slowly, not from weakness, but from the growing weight of realization that each step wasn't just leading her forward, it was drawing her deeper into a history that had been carefully scattered, like breadcrumbs meant to be followed only by someone brave enough to want the truth. The dog, steady and silent, walked ahead just far enough to guide but never so far as to leave her behind, her paws making no sound on the leaf-covered trail. And though Martha still couldn't remember what lay at the end of this path, something in her chest began to tighten, not with fear, but with the unmistakable pull of a memory trying to fight its way back from the shadows. The building appeared slowly through the trees, its red-painted trim faded by years of rain and sun, the sign above the porch leaning slightly to the left, the letters still readable if you took a moment to squint, Willow Glen Animal Refuge. A small wind chime tinkled on the corner of the porch, making music with the breeze, and the scent of hay, fir, and old pine wood wrapped itself around her like a song she once knew the words to but hadn't sung in years. They stepped onto the porch together, and before Martha could even lift her hand to knock, the door opened slowly, revealing a woman in her early 60s with silver hair tied back in a fraying braid, eyes sharp with recognition and disbelief. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips and took one unsteady step forward. "Oh dear Lord!" "Martha," the woman whispered, her voice catching like a thread on broken glass. "They told us you were gone. They said you wouldn't remember, wouldn't ever come back here again." Martha studied her face, looking for something familiar, and though she didn't remember the woman's name, the warmth in her eyes settled something inside her that had been restless since the journey began. "I don't know who told you that," she said quietly, "but I think they lied about a lot of things." The woman introduced herself as Carol, the shelter's longtime manager, and led her inside slowly, motioning to the worn couch beside the front desk where dozens of adoption photos were tacked to the wall, faces of children, couples, veterans, all smiling with the dogs they'd taken home from Willow Glen. But among the sea of faces, Martha's own eyes fell on a single photograph, framed and dusty, hanging slightly askew near the light switch. It showed her standing in that very lobby, younger than she felt but older than she remembered being, her arm draped over the back of a young German shepherd whose ears stood tall and proud, her eyes glowing with fierce loyalty. Her own smile in the photo was soft but tired, like someone who had carried too much and still managed to offer comfort anyway. "That's the day you adopted Ruby," Carol said, stepping beside her and gently adjusting the frame. "You came in with a folder under your arm, said you'd been told not to keep a pet while recovering, but that something didn't feel right about that." Martha turned toward the dog now, Rube, as she called her, and saw her sitting by the door, quiet and watchful, as if waiting for Martha to remember not just where she was, but why she had come. "You told me you weren't confused," Carol continued, her voice growing more certain now. "You said you were being made to feel confused." She stepped behind the desk and pulled open the lowest drawer, rummaging through papers that had yellowed with time. "I didn't believe it at first, but then you handed me this." She retrieved a single sheet of paper, creased, faded, and thin from handling, and laid it gently in Martha's lap. It was a legal form, half filled out, the ink slightly smudged in places, but one line stood out in bold: "Do not contact Dr. Harvey Emerson regarding this animal or its owner." Martha stared at the paper, her fingers trembling as they followed the letters she barely remembered writing. Beneath the printed line, in her own handwriting, was a note, wobbly, urgent, and scrawled as if time had been running out: "If something happens to me, this dog will lead me home." Carol's eyes were damp now, though no tears had fallen yet. "You told me you were losing time, not in the normal way people do, but like pieces were being taken from you deliberately. And when I asked if you meant forgetfulness, you just shook your head and said, 'No, they're trying to erase me.'" The room fell silent then, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It was the silence of realization, of two women finally understanding that whatever had happened back then wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, but the slow unraveling of a plan that someone had been carefully hiding for years. "You were scared," Carol said finally, looking directly into her eyes, "but you weren't helpless. You had a plan. You told me Ruby would remember what you couldn't. That she would take you to the places that mattered. That she would help you find the truth again, before it was too late." Martha sat very still for a long while, holding the paper in her lap like a fragment of her own soul returned at last, and though her mind still didn't have all the answers, her heart had begun to believe in something stronger than confusion. She looked down at Rube, who now sat quietly beside the couch, head resting gently against her knee, as though waiting for the next piece to be placed in the puzzle. Martha ran her hand over the dog's fur, then turned back to Carol, her voice soft but full of something deeper now, a question she hadn't dared ask until this very moment. "Carol, was someone trying to take my life from me?" "I think someone tried to erase you." Carol didn't answer right away, and for a long, heavy moment, the only sound in that little room was the ticking of an old clock on the wall, its rhythm slow and deliberate, like it too was waiting for the right words to come. She lowered herself carefully into the chair behind the desk, her hands resting flat on the wood, her eyes distant now, as though staring at something far beyond the shelter walls, something that had haunted her for far too long. "I think someone tried to erase you, Martha," she said finally, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Martha's chest tighten with both fear and recognition. "And I think they nearly succeeded, because after you left that day, after you adopted Ruby, something happened that I've never forgotten, no matter how hard I tried." The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long lines across the floor, and the air seemed to grow still, as if the world outside was holding its breath alongside them. Carol leaned forward, her voice dropping lower, her words slower now, like she was confessing a sin that had been locked in the corners of her mind for too many years. "A man came by, just a few days later," she began, her eyes narrowing as she spoke, the memory sharpening with each syllable. "Tall, dressed in a gray suit pressed so crisp it looked like it could cut glass, and shoes that didn't belong in a place like this, too polished, too clean, like they'd never once touched the dirt of this world." Martha listened, her heart beating harder now, because even though she couldn't picture the man, she could feel the shadow of him, the chill of someone who moved through life without leaving footprints. "He said he was a friend of yours," Carol went on, her voice trembling now not from uncertainty but from the memory of the fear she hadn't admitted to herself at the time. Said he was checking in, making sure everything was all right, that you were adjusting well with the dog and settling where you were supposed to be. But Martha, he never asked about you. He asked about me. About whether I'd seen anything unusual. About whether you'd said anything concerning. The dog shifted then, as if sensing the tension thickening in the air, and laid her head against Martha's knee once more, grounding her in the moment, reminding her that no matter how dark the road became, she was not alone. Carol reached into the bottom drawer of the desk, her fingers fumbling as though they, too, had grown afraid of what they might find, and pulled out a small, sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges but still intact, untouched since the day it was handed to her. He left this, she whispered, sliding it across the desk toward Martha as if it burned to hold it any longer. Told me to open it only if you ever came back asking questions. I've kept it hidden all these years, hoping, praying, you'd walk through that door again before I ever had to break that seal. Martha stared at the envelope, her fingers hovering just above it, as if the simple act of touching it might unleash all the memories she both longed for and feared. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried not just words but consequences, and for a moment, she considered walking away from it, leaving it unopened, letting the past stay buried where someone had wanted it kept. But the truth was, the past wasn't buried. It was following her, step by step, place by place, like a shadow that grew longer each time the sun set on another forgotten memory. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. Carol, she asked quietly, though the weight of the question filled the room like thunder, do you think that man was the reason I lost everything? Carol looked down, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt like a woman trying to wring out the guilt from her soul, and when she finally lifted her eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. I don't know for certain, she said, each word slow, deliberate, and honest, but I think he was part of it, Martha. And I think whoever sent him wasn't finished with you, not then, and maybe not even now. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, carrying with it the kind of chill that comes when old secrets begin to stir from their slumber. Inside, the envelope sat between them, untouched, but no longer ignored. The dog rose, ears perked toward the door as if she could already sense the next destination calling, the next clue waiting quietly on the road ahead. And Martha, feeling the weight of both the envelope and Carol's words settle into her bones, knew that whatever came next would take more courage than anything she'd faced so far. She slid the envelope into her bag, the paper crinkling softly like dry leaves underfoot, and glanced at the dog, her voice low, filled with a question that reached far beyond the walls of the shelter. Where do we go from here? Because I heard a confession I was never meant to remember. The road out of Willow Glen stretched long and narrow beneath the dimming light, the sky overhead painted with the soft lavender of early evening, and Martha walked it slowly, the kind of slow that isn't weakness but intention, a pace set by someone who knows that what waits at the end might change everything. Rube stayed close now, her steps more cautious than before, as if even she sensed that this part of the journey would carry a heavier weight than the rest. They followed the fence line for nearly half a mile until the trees opened to reveal a white chapel tucked into the hillside, its paint weathered and flaking, its steeple leaning slightly, but its stained glass windows still glowing faintly in the last golden light like the last memory left untouched. The wind carried the scent of pine, old stone, and something softer, perhaps the memory of 100 Sunday hymns, sung in worn voices that still echoed through the floorboards. As they approached, the wooden door creaked open slowly, not because it had been forced, but because someone had been watching, waiting, perhaps praying that one day Martha Ellington might find her way back to this place. An older man stepped into the doorway, his white collar slightly askew, his sweater frayed at the elbows, but his eyes as clear as spring water drawn from deep beneath the earth. Martha, he said, as though tasting the name after too many years of silence. I wasn't sure if it would be you, or just the dog without you. But I've kept my promise either way. She didn't recognize him at first, though the lines around his eyes told her they had known each other once, in the way people who sit beside each other through loss and grace and long, quiet Sundays always do. You know me, she said slowly, more as a statement than a question, though she needed the answer more than she wanted to admit. Reverend Samuel Burke, he replied, extending a weathered hand, not as a man of the cloth but as an old friend who still remembered the days before everything had gone wrong. You used to sit in the back pew, left side, always 5 minutes early. You said you liked to hear the silence before the music began. Martha stepped inside, the dog following at her heels, and the smell of wood polish and candle wax wrapped around her like an old shawl long tucked away in the attic. She glanced toward the altar, where sunlight poured through the colored glass onto the floor, forming patterns that moved ever so slightly with the breeze. I remember this place, she whispered, more to herself than to the Reverend, her voice trembling with something she didn't yet understand. But I don't remember why it matters. He nodded slowly, walking with her down the aisle, past the pews where ghosts of former congregants seemed to linger just beneath the surface of the wood, waiting for a song, a prayer, or a memory to bring them back. You came here toward the end, he said softly, when things had already begun to slip. You told me you were afraid, not just of forgetting, but of being forgotten by someone who once swore they'd never leave you. They sat in the front pew, and for a long time neither spoke, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. Finally, Reverend Burke reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages softened by age and handling. You asked me to write something down for you, he said, his voice now touched with something deeper, regret, perhaps, or guilt. You told me that if one day you came back without your memories, I should read this to you, and not until then. He opened the notebook to a marked page and began to read slowly, his voice deep and deliberate. If I return here broken, do not call the man who claims to be my doctor. Do not let him near me. He speaks softly, but his lies are louder than the truth. And if I forget this myself, tell me what I told you, that the ones who love you never ask for silence. They ask for truth, even when it hurts. Martha closed her eyes and let the words settle inside her like seeds in rich soil, and for the first time in days, something truly familiar passed through her, the sound of her own voice, hidden in someone else's mouth. I wrote that? She asked, her throat dry. You did, he answered gently, placing the notebook in her lap. And there's something else. Something I've never told anyone, because I wasn't supposed to hear it in the first place. Martha looked at him then, her gaze sharper now, pulled forward by the weight of something unspoken. What did you hear? He drew in a breath that trembled on the way out, and for a man who had stood beside caskets and cradles, weddings and betrayals, this seemed to cost him more than any sermon ever had. One night, I was in the back office, finishing paperwork after a funeral, he began, each word heavier than the last. The door to the confession room had been left open by mistake, and I was locking up when I heard voices, not prayers, not sorrow, but plans. Quiet, careful plans between two men, one of whom I recognized immediately. Martha leaned forward, her heart pounding now not with confusion but with the sickening certainty that someone she once trusted had used that very trust as a weapon. They spoke about you, Martha. About how your signature was already on the forms, and how your memory loss was progressing faster than expected. One of them laughed and said, by the time she realizes what's been done, she won't even remember who to blame. The word struck like thunder, loud and cold, shaking something loose deep inside her, something she hadn't yet reached, but now knew was there. She looked down at the dog, who sat motionless beside her feet, and felt the question rising in her like the tide creeping back across the shore. Do you remember what the other man's name was? It was Thomas. Thomas Langley. Reverend Burke didn't say the name quickly, nor did he toss it out like some trivial detail from a long-forgotten story. Instead, he let it sit on his tongue for a moment, tasting the weight of it, feeling the consequence of speaking aloud a truth that had remained buried beneath years of polite silence and carefully avoided questions. It was Thomas, he said quietly, his voice steadier than his eyes, which had begun to glisten beneath the golden glow of the stained glass. Thomas Langley. That was the name the other man called him. And he responded to it like someone who had worn it comfortably for a very long time. At first, the name didn't land, not fully. It floated around inside Martha's mind like a loose thread, unclaimed and unanchored, until slowly, painfully, it began to sink, settling into the corners of her thoughts like dust stirred from an old attic. Her lips parted, but no words came, not because she couldn't speak, but because she couldn't yet reconcile the name with the face that slowly, relentlessly began to take shape behind her eyes. Thomas Langley had been her attorney. Not just her legal advisor, but her trusted advocate, the man who had drawn up her will, handled the deed to her house, reviewed the trust fund she had established after Joseph's passing. He had sat at her kitchen table more times than she could count, sipping her coffee, asking about her health, complimenting her dog, assuring her that everything was in good hands. He had smiled gently the day she signed over temporary power of attorney, promising it was only a precaution until her episodes passed, and he had clasped her hand afterward, looking her in the eye with the cool confidence of a man who knew she would never remember the day he betrayed her. Martha sat back slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the pew as if anchoring herself against the rising tide of realization. She had trusted him, leaned on him, allowed him to speak on her behalf when her voice had begun to falter, and all the while, he had stood behind her with a knife already pressed to the back of her life. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice low and strained with disbelief. "Why would he do that? What could he possibly gain from taking everything from me?" Reverend Burke sighed and rubbed his temple, the movement weary and slow, like a man tired of carrying secrets that were never meant to be his. "I didn't understand it either," he said, "not until the second time I saw him. It was a month after the confession. He came to a service, sat in the very back pew. Didn't speak, didn't pray. Just watched." Martha stared at him, heart thudding louder now, not from fear but from something older, betrayal's bitter twin, called recognition. Burke continued, his voice like wind curling through brittle trees. "Afterward, I found him standing by the memorial wall, the one with all the brass plaques for departed members. And he said, 'I'm making sure she disappears without becoming a martyr. People forget what they're not reminded of.' Then he walked out, and I never saw him again." Martha pressed a hand over her chest as though trying to still the tremor rising inside her ribs, but it was no use. The pieces were beginning to connect now, not clearly, not fully, but with enough clarity to chill her to the bone. Thomas had not acted alone. He was meticulous, yes, but he was also cautious, a man who never moved without layers of protection. Which meant someone had been helping him, someone who understood how to manipulate medical records, redirect finances, and isolate a woman from her own history under the guise of care. She looked down at Rube, who had not moved since they'd sat down, and something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an understanding that there was more to uncover, more shadows to bring into the light, and that the journey was far from over. Reverend Burke reached for her hand and held it gently between both of his skin warm and worn, like old parchment that had weathered too many seasons. "You were right to come back," he said. "And I think you were right to let the dog lead you. You may not remember the whole truth yet, but I believe you already know where it ends." The late light slanted across the floor now, painting the chapel in gold and fire, and the dust swirled softly in the beams, as though the past itself had begun to stir from its long slumber. Outside, the wind picked up again, shaking the chapel's bell gently, though no one had touched it. It rang just once, low and hollow, and the sound settled into the pit of Martha's stomach like a final warning. She stood slowly, her legs uncertain, her heart far from it, and stepped out into the coming twilight with Rube at her side, the chapel door closing quietly behind her. The next place waited, she could feel it pulling at her bones, calling to her from somewhere not far away, somewhere full of silence and old dust and things once meant to be hidden. As they reached the edge of the trail, she turned toward the dog with a voice just loud enough for the wind to carry. "Where did I go next, Rube? What did I find there that made them so desperate to silence me? Because what you hid there could have destroyed them all." The road turned narrow as they moved beyond the last cluster of houses on the edge of town, where the sidewalks crumbled into gravel and the trees leaned a little closer to the road, as if whispering to one another in voices too old to translate. Martha walked in silence now, the kind that comes not from fear but from preparation, her hands tucked into the deep pockets of her coat, fingers curled around the folded envelope Carol had given her, the paper inside like a pulse she could feel even through the fabric. Rube walked ahead, her movements slow and deliberate, her tail low but steady, as though she too understood that what lay ahead was not just a place but a memory that had waited patiently behind locked doors and shuttered windows, refusing to die even as those who feared it tried to erase the woman who carried it. The house appeared slowly, just beyond the bend, its roof sagging near the chimney, its shutters dangling on rusted hinges, and ivy curling across the porch like a hand that never let go. It wasn't large, but it had once been beautiful, the kind of house that held family dinners and laughter on quiet Saturday nights, the kind where someone could grow old with grace and dignity. But now it looked abandoned, forgotten by time, like a place meant to be lost. And yet Martha stopped in front of it, not from hesitation, but from recognition so deep it ached in her bones, a recognition that said this was once mine, and someone tried to take it from me. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, the hinges groaning like an old man remembering pain, and the porch steps bowed beneath her feet as she climbed them, each one softer than the last. The front door was locked, but not well. With a gentle push and a firm shoulder, it opened inward, revealing a room that smelled of dust, stale air, and something else, a scent she couldn't name but knew she had lived with once every day. Inside, the furniture was draped in white sheets that had yellowed over time, and the pictures on the wall hung crooked, the faces inside them barely visible behind cloudy glass. The house wasn't empty, it was simply paused, like someone had walked out one day and never returned, leaving everything to wait in silence. She moved slowly through the front room, her fingers trailing the tops of covered tables, and found herself staring at a painting on the wall, a scene of wildflowers on a hill beneath a sky of gold. She didn't remember the painter, but she remembered buying it. She remembered loving it. She remembered hanging it there herself. And that was when the dog turned, padded across the room, and sat down in front of the hallway closet near the stairs, head tilted, ears perked, tail still. A single low whine slipped from her throat, soft and certain, and Martha's heart began to race, not from panic, but from the certainty that behind that door lay something too important to leave behind. She opened the closet door slowly, half expecting to find nothing but coats and boxes, but inside was a narrow panel of wood, barely wider than her shoulders, with a handle she hadn't remembered installing but somehow still knew how to pull. The panel creaked outward, revealing a narrow set of stairs that led down into darkness, a cellar, or something older. Her feet hesitated at the top step, but Rube had already begun to descend, each paw step careful and confident, as if she had walked those stairs before. With one hand on the wall and the other holding the strap of her bag, Martha followed her down, the air growing cooler with every step, the kind of cool that belongs to places untouched by sunlight for far too long. The basement was small, unfinished, and musty, but there in the far corner stood a filing cabinet, one she didn't remember moving down there, but which she'd clearly once placed with purpose. On top of it sat a box, sealed with yellowing tape and labeled in her own handwriting, "Personal, do not remove." Her fingers trembled as she peeled away the tape and opened the lid, revealing folders, dozens of them, each one marked with dates, names, and notes scribbled in the margins. She pulled one out and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of financial records, medical forms, notarized signatures, letters written in her own hand, some pleading, some angry, but all unmistakably real. One in particular made her breath hitch. It was a power of attorney document, signed by her, but the signature had been traced. Not forged, traced. A light pen had been used beneath a heavy hand, mimicking her signature with eerie precision. And below that, the witness signature, T. Langley. Martha staggered back slightly, her hand gripping the edge of the table for support. Her mind didn't remember signing it, but her body remembered being tired, her wrist aching, her eyes too blurry to focus, and a calm voice saying, "It's just for now, Martha. Just until you're well again." In the bottom of the box lay a cassette tape, unmarked, dusty, its ribbon spooled tightly but its plastic case worn thin at the corners. She turned it over in her hands, her heart thudding louder than before. There had been a tape recorder upstairs, she remembered that now. Joseph used it to leave voice notes when his hands began to fail him. Without thinking, she turned to Rube, who stood at the foot of the stairs, tail thumping once against the wood, as if waiting for her to understand what this meant. And suddenly it came back, not all at once, but in a wave strong enough to shake her knees. Joseph had discovered what Thomas was doing. He had tried to record a message, a final message, proof of the betrayal, and she had hidden it before anyone else could find it. She picked up the tape with trembling hands and turned toward the stairs, her voice barely more than breath. "Rube," she whispered, "if I knew the truth this whole time, why didn't I tell anyone before they took it all? Because the one you trusted most was the one who made you forget." The recorder was right where she remembered it, in the back of Joseph's desk drawer, wrapped in a faded handkerchief that still smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and the cologne he wore on Sundays when he wanted to feel like the man he used to be. Martha sat slowly in the old armchair by the fireplace, its cushions sunken from years of use, and stared at the black cassette tape in her hands, her fingers brushing over its smooth surface like it was something alive, something that still held breath, and voice, and pain. Rube lay by her feet, one paw crossed over the other, eyes trained on the hearth like she, too, was waiting for the words that would finally close a chapter that had been left open for far too long. With a soft click, the tape slid into place, and for a long, breathless moment, all Martha heard was static, gentle, distant, like wind moving across a field of dry grass in autumn. Then, the sound of a man clearing his throat, low and weary, followed by the familiar voice of Joseph Ellington, older, slower, but still unmistakably him. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, "cracked at the edges like old wood, then they got to you before I could stop them." Martha's breath caught in her chest, and her hands clenched around the armrests, as if holding on to something solid might keep the truth from shattering what was left of her carefully stitched-together world. "I've tried everything I know," Joseph continued, his voice now steadier, like a man speaking not out of fear but out of duty. "But Thomas won't return my calls, and Harvey keeps giving me the same line about temporary cognitive decline, like I'm some child asking the same question twice." There was a pause, breathing, the sound of something rustling, perhaps papers being moved, then Joseph spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Martha, they're doing this on purpose. They're gaslighting you. They've changed your medication, diluted your prescriptions, replaced doctors without telling you. It's not incompetence. It's strategy." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away, didn't blink. She needed every word, needed the full shape of the truth she had been denied. "Langley doesn't want your estate," Joseph said, his voice tight now. "He wants the land. He's got a buyer, private equity group in Chicago. They're offering him $6 million under the table. But he needs your name out of the way. And Harvey, he's not your doctor, sweetheart. He's Langley's cousin. Changed his name when he moved out east." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, not in surprise, but in horror, the kind that creeps in slow like smoke and doesn't let go. "I've hidden the files in the basement," Joseph went on, voice trembling now, as though he could sense the walls closing in around him. "The real ones. Originals. They're enough to stop everything, but only if someone finds them before they're shredded or replaced." Then came silence, longer this time, the kind of silence that stretches between two people who know they may never speak again. "I'm scared, Martha," Joseph said softly. "Not for me. For you. Because if they can make you forget, they can make you disappear. But I've done what I can. If Rube leads you here, it means something in you still remembers how to fight. Don't stop now. Don't let them win." And with that, the tape ended. No grand finale, no final note of comfort, just the soft click of the recorder stopping, followed by the unbearable stillness of a house that had been too quiet for too long. Martha sat there for a long time, her hands clasped in her lap, the fire long cold in the hearth before she finally stood. She moved through the house slowly now, not searching, but gathering, documents, tapes, photographs, every trace of herself that someone else had tried to erase. By the time the sun rose, she had everything packed neatly in a canvas bag, zipped and heavy, like a second chance stitched together from paper and ink. Rube sat at the door, ready to go, tail tapping softly against the floor like a metronome keeping time. Outside, the morning was quiet but alive, birds calling through the trees, the distant rumble of a car, the scent of earth warming in the light. Martha stood on the porch, her spine straight now, her eyes clearer than they had been in years, and she knew exactly where she needed to go. Not to the police. Not yet. First, she needed to see the man who had smiled into her face while cutting the foundation out from beneath her life. She needed to look Thomas Langley in the eye, not for revenge, but for something deeper. She needed him to see what survival looked like. And as Rube walked beside her down the gravel path, Martha turned to the horizon, her voice soft but strong enough for the wind to carry. "What do you say, girl?" she asked, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Shall we go remind him who I really am? Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.